learning more about the Data2Action project. And, with that, I'm going to start the program. So I'm your host for the day, your MC, if you will, Alina Turner. I'm the co-founder at HelpSeeker. We run these webinars about once a month with different exciting projects that HelpSeeker has the honor to be involved in. And this is one that's a really near and dear to us, because it's one that was started when we were just starting out as a startup. And so we're really excited to share some of the learnings on this with you, and just keep the conversation going in the domestic violence and sexual violence sector around the importance of data-based decision-making and policy work. So we wouldn't be HelpSeeker if we didn't start the work in the right way. And for myself and the collaborators and co-presenters on this, we are welcoming all of you from across Turtle Island, and myself, I'm joining you from Mohkinstsis, which is Treaty 7 territory here in Calgary. All of us that are presenting today are coming from settler organizations, and we do this work with full commitment to advancing reconciliation. And we have our specific actions that we take, at least on an annual basis, on what are we going to do this year to advance reconciliation. And again, I'm happy if anybody ever gets stuck, that this is becoming route and you're not seeing it in your business plan, what you're doing around this work. I'm more than happy to share those learnings from us as well. So with that, I shall give you the 2-second who HelpSeeker is, because you're coming to a HelpSeeker webinar. So we're a data software and expertise company out of the social technology space, but we all actually have backgrounds in the social sector, and as social scientists, as people that are practitioners in this work. And we build data, we build software, we build these frameworks and solutions for complex social challenges, including what we're talking about today, domestic violence. So we're by no means the solution. We help people on the front lines, lots of folks like yourselves that are doing the work. So look at us as accelerant to your efforts. We don't do anything without a partner. Here's your kind of panel today. I've known Lana since I was literally a kid, because she was the one who gave me my first job in Calgary when we were both at the United Way. She asked me some really hard questions in the interview, and I thought I wasn't going to get it. And that was like 20 years ago. But Lana is the lead of SHIFT, the project to prevent, it's a primary prevention around domestic violence at the University of Calgary. She's just irreverent in her work, and is well known internationally actually for her advocacy work here. Carrie is the innovation director at Sagesse, and they are the conveners of Impact, which is this amazing collective impact effort to build capacity in the sector to do this work at a systems change level. And Carrie, same thing, just like things very differently about all these challenges, and comes up with solutions that are everything from social enterprise to policy advocacy in very, very novel ways. So really loved working with her on this too. And our keeping us honest research academic extraordinaire, Dr. Baker, Elizabeth Baker, also was SHIFT in U Calgary, and that research scientist that's always like, that's cool about Google, but we all know the problems with big data. So just amazing researcher. She does this work in not just domestic violence, but so if you ever are looking for that partner that knows how to do academic work, but still engages in policy considerations, and she's definitely somebody you should be connecting with further. So a bit of the agenda for today, and I'm rushing a little bit, but only because I want to get to the good stuff. We're going to give you the spiel on what Data2Action was. We're going to give you everything from the impetus to where we got to, and then we're going to get into a bit of a more exciting reflection discussion to get at the takeaways, because at the end of the day, this was a big R&D endeavor, and it was an R&D data endeavor in a sector that was undergoing a massive challenge with COVID, the same as everybody else. But in the domestic violence and sexual violence world, we all know that COVID had a much more acute and multi-layered impact to the work. So to do an R&D data project during COVID is like a whole different ball game. So we don't want to lose the opportunity to have these reflections shared with you guys as well. So we're going to leave lots of time for that. Couple of takeaways, and we'll let y'all go to back to your day-to-day lives. So I'll give you the where this lightning bolt of insight came, and to get this ball rolling during the maybe first or second wave of COVID. We were doing a webinar, myself and at the School of Public Policy that Lana was watching, and I was talking about how during COVID we're going to start to see these different shifts in help-seeking behaviors, and I was showing some data from the HelpSeeker platform, and she came to me and this flash of, what is happening in the domestic violence and sexual violence world. If we could actually pull all this data together, what might it tell us about what's happening in the sector that we don't know about today? So here's the kind of two components. We said, how can we create this dashboard to monitor and understand emergent patterns? And then the second part was, okay, and then how can we also amp up how Albertans connect with up-to-date services information and inform this preventative agenda with this insight and information? So how can we take all this work we're doing around data, but feed it to connect people better to help, and then inform public policy and future research as well? So that was the impetus 3 years ago or so. But of course, there's different angles to the impetus depending on the partner as well. So I think with that, let me hand it to you, Lana, to give a little bit of context on shifts and the primary prevention lens on this effort as well.
Thanks, Alina, and welcome everyone. So glad you joined us today. For us, just for those who don't know, we are a primary prevention initiative located in the Faculty of Social Work at the University of Calgary. We've been there 12 plus years trying to advance primary prevention. So it's really about stopping the violence before it starts through structural, cultural change, creating social conditions to support healthy relationships and to prevent perpetration of violence. And so we do it in several ways, and why this project was super important was, one, we do work a lot around policy and legislation, which of course are tools around behavior change. So we wanted to better understand, could we get better data on domestic and sexual violence? Because where we are getting it, or we're getting it, are from police data, which we know a lot of people don't go to police, or from Stats Canada with retroactive. And with COVID coming and happening, we knew that rates were increasing and severity were increasing as well. And we wanted different ways to collect. And also recognizing around big data and this fourth revolution around technology, feeling a little bit behind. I know for myself, if you think about predictive analysis, machine learning, surveillance capitalism, like these concepts were coming up, didn't really understand. And so how can we use technology to actually advance equity and inclusion and advance rights and so forth? So that's why we were super interested. Part of our role is to do R&D, to test new ideas, and to then make research accessible to those that can integrate, whether at the policy or community level. So our interest and why I came to Alina was really, she was really looking at the tech sector and how to leverage it. And I just felt, for me, so behind, as well as feeling like the sector, how could we up our game in this area to actually get into that revolution and not be led by it, but actually start leading some of the change. So that was why and our project got interested in this initiative.
Awesome. Thank you. All right. Well, why don't we jump over to you at Sagesse and Impact, Carrie?
Thanks, Alina, and thanks everyone for joining. It's fascinating, I think, actually, that to be at this point of the project and to hear that conversation that you guys are having about the conversations you were having, because they so mirror the conversations that we were having at Impact. And so it was sort of a fascinating time of being in the first wave of COVID. And during that time, Sagesse, who is the backbone organization for Impact, had really stepped into a role where we were doing lots of support and lots of R&D, because everybody was doing R&D because we were in a time that was unprecedented. And we were doing lots of that through our role of Impact and supporting organizations who are working to eradicate domestic and sexual violence all across Alberta. And within that, we sort of recognized amongst ourselves that there was a unique experience that was happening. We didn't really know what it was. We couldn't really frame it, but we knew that what was happening with COVID was something that we wanted to be able to capture. And wouldn't it be great if we could use data to be able to do that? And that was actually what caused us to reach out to Alina and Lana and say, hey, we're having this conversation, which mirrored conversations that they were having as well, to be sort of the impetus in the starting of the project.
Awesome. So why don't we go over a little bit of the partner roles too, and Carrie, since you were kind of the collective impact lead for us as well on this project, did you want to take this one away as well? Yeah, absolutely.
So when we started talking about and thinking about data projects, and really when I think about and look at any kind of R&D project, we're always looking at what are the different roles that we need to have contained within this work. And so one of the roles, if we're looking at understanding the experiences of domestic abuse and how data is being collected and being shared and what can we learn from that, obviously, we need data curators. And I am very clear that that is not a me thing. And so that's where the role of HelpSeeker came in. They have a skill set, they have a technology, capacity, system mapping, all of those things that are outside of what I think often exists within the roles and capacities of community-based organizations. And so we wanted to bring them in with that. The shift component is that if we're collecting data, if we're gathering things, what does that mean? And that was really where we looked at, from a primary prevention perspective, what is the role that Lana and Liz can have in terms of helping to interpret that data, helping to make recommendations based off of that? What do we learn based off of the things that we're doing? And then impact, and I am biased, so I'll put that out there. I think impact is sort of the center part of that because it is the community base. We can't do data conversations if we're not working from a community perspective, if we're not connecting with what is important to community in terms of the data that they are collecting, the things that they are seeing, the trends that are happening. And how do we, we had lots of early conversations as we worked through this to talk about how do we take data from being something that lives for someone else to being something that is reclaimed by community organizations and for community organizations so that they can be using that to better support the clients and communities that they're working with. And so that was the role that Impact did. And I think each of us kind of came in with those particular lenses, those particular perspectives, which led to lots of fierce conversations between the three of us when our lenses or our perspectives hit sort of counterpoints, but I think allowed for more in-depthful R&D process as we went through this innovative project.
Awesome. So again, we hinted a little bit about the impetus to get things moving. I'm wondering, Lana, if you want to touch on the, as we got going on the scoping of this and as we learned about what we wanted to do.
Yeah, I think to take everyone back to the beginning, we know that there's no central repository of comprehensive cross-analyzed violence data, not just in Alberta, in Canada, or worldwide. And then, of course, the impetus was COVID. All of a sudden, everybody was at home being forced to use technology. And so there was an uptake or interest of how can we actually leverage it. for us, and I think the group, we really wanted to broaden our measures and indicators, right? Because we knew demand was changing and things were changing. And what were we going to look at as a baseline or changes to monitor over time? Because we don't really have a specific data set in Canada or benchmark data. I know there's SDGs and we've been looking at some of those things, but governments haven't adopted measures and ways to look over time. And so we thought, could we start to use this different data sets to be able to do that and start to think about big data in our area? We also, as I mentioned earlier, wanted to leverage new technologies, right? How do we automate? What can we automate? How do we use predictive analysis? Because, you know, we're all being shaped by social media and technology. And so how can we actually leverage it for positive pro-social behaviors? And then, of course, for us, really the practice changes Carrie mentioned and the policy change, how can we start aligning and advancing a preventative systemic approach to actually dealing with the issues that we're seeing so that we can actually inform in real time, both policymakers and service providers, so that we could be changing and adapting as needed to the population's needs. So those were the overall impetus for the project.
Okay, so just a little, I mentioned that we were going to have to do our obligatory shout outs. We connected with so many of the sector's key players and organizations across the province to make this happen. So I want to take a second here to just show you guys how engaged the sector has been in providing input, in providing, in some cases, provided actually their data to the project. So some folks are actually they submitted data every month for us to be able to understand what was actually happening in the state of the data in the sector. So lots and lots of contributions from organizations across this awesome province. We, of course, have to also acknowledge that none of this stuff would be possible without somebody funding it. So the Canadian Women's Foundation and Civil Society Fund through the Government of Alberta were the two big investors in this. And the part at the bottom here, the Research Advisory Committee, while we were doing this work with the community, we also had a parallel process, and Lana, please jump in here too, but we had a parallel process through a research committee that included folks like Nicole Latourneau, Stephanie Montesanti. Anyways, they're all listed here. I'm not going to single anybody else out, but just real rigor around and critique as well of the data analysis, the data visualization, the interpretation of the data, et cetera, so that we weren't making some of these decisions just as project partners. We were doing this in conversation with academic and community sectors as well. So just a big thank you for those that provided insights, participation, data, and guidance through this project, because none of this would be possible without you. And of course, a big thank you to the funders as well. Lana or Carrie, Liz, did you want to jump in on this slide if there's anything I didn't properly acknowledge here? Nope. I think silence is king, I guess. So this is the main event. This is the exciting part. Even though it's a data webinar, we wanted to bring a lens from an R&D perspective on what the key themes and learnings have been on this project as well. So a couple of these, I'll just get the conversation going, but we're actually going to tackle each of these themes. So the speakers, we actually, not necessarily practice these, but we have been in conversations about these themes throughout the last number of years. And so we all have our own take on them, our own perspectives on them. So I'm going to kick us off, but I'm going to obviously rely on my co-speakers to jump in and bring their insights to these questions. So the first theme, as you can see there, is this project really validated the need for data once again for us. I'll speak from HelpSeeker, and then I'll punt it over to Liz on this one to take her take on it next. But for us, the validation for data, was proved to be a little bit nuanced. So for HelpSeeker, we do bring data in from different sources into our system already. What we were really, really challenged with in this project is that, as Lana mentioned before, there isn't a very good data set on that's aligned across the sector to actually answer some of the business questions or research or strategic questions that organizations had. So, and on the one hand, when we did our collaborator workshops to understand, okay, what does the executive director need to know? What does the policymaker need to know? And when we did the cross-reference between the research requirements, strategy requirements, business requirements, and the data that was being collected, there was oftentimes these major chasms. So the things we're collecting are never going to answer the data that's needed to answer those pressing questions. So there's this mismatch between the data and the requirements that really, for me, validated this need for not data, but specific kinds of data that's aligned to answer those questions. So we got lots of more ideas about how to tackle that gap, but that's my take. So Liz, I'll flip it to you now for your thoughts on this one.
Yeah, sure. I think you did a wonderful job of just summing it up, and it's something that has continually been talked about, because the data that currently exists is unique to whatever source is collecting that, which makes a lot of sense, right? Each organization has a specific purpose for why they're collecting the data that they are collecting. But it only gives us one piece of the puzzle. So for example, if we have data coming from police organizations, that's telling us about people who are engaging in help seeking that is pretty narrow and specific. Not everyone is going to go to the police if they're experiencing an issue that they want help with. So we know that we have snippets of information from different organizations, from nonprofits, from all these different agencies, but we want to really expand because that's not representative of everyone who lives in Alberta. And I won't talk too much about that unless there are specific questions. I think that's something many people can agree on, but we know that even if there is this need, this motivation to say, yes, if I had a magic wand, I wish I could get information on everything possible, there are a lot of barriers to data capacity from all different angles. So to do this type of work, it really isn't a quick fix, even in the best of times. So if everyone was, feeling wonderful with their time and space and what they had to offer, it takes a lot of time to really understand how to do this work and how to do it well. But at the organizations who we are asking to hopefully give us data, there really isn't time for people to do this work, and there isn't money, and they're already overburdened. So it's a huge ask to people to add something to their plate when they already are being pulled in so many different directions. And so it's not just the organizations, though, that have structural barriers to data capacity. So if we think about from my lens, the researchers, for example, not all researchers have trusting organizations with all of these trusting relationships with the different organizations. And it really is a skill set to learn the best ways to work alongside different partners to co-create and do it in a way where everyone is working together. And so there are a lot of learnings from the side. As the researcher, I've learned so much, really a lot in my conversations with Carrie, for example, about best ways to approach this and to really understand the data in context. And related to that, there are data scientists who have a wonderful depth of knowledge for how to do visualizations and analysis and all of these things. But a lot of existing programs, I would actually say probably most, but please correct me if I'm wrong, I'd like to learn more about it, don't have things incorporated into their curriculum to help them understand the ways in which we really understand the data from the people who are collecting it. So you may think you know what it means, but you actually don't know until you have those conversations and say, when you're giving me this, how did you define this? What are the things to keep in context? Are there limitations to the way I can interpret this data? Things like that. So from all different sides, all different partners, there are a lot of structural barriers that we need to address, and it's going to take a long time. But I think from this project, there are a lot of really valuable learnings where now we know what they are. And once we know what they are, we can create strategies to try and hopefully overcome those barriers. So I'll pause to see if either there are questions or other people want to chime in.
I just want to add, I think that, thank you, Liz, so much for bringing that forward. And I think that what was really interesting for me, and I see some people on the call who have been part of other shared measurement projects with the CDVC that we were in. And, I think that the thing that we know is that there is data and organizations have data. And part of, I think, the sort of idea that we had coming in to this is, how do we not ask people for more things? How do we not overburden? We were in the first wave of COVID, as I like to say, that we were so naive at that point. We thought COVID was going to be done in just a few months. And, it would be this lovely sort of window of time where we could do this sort of recognize this social experiment. But people have lots of data and lots of pieces that are existing within their organizations. And so much of that is about this sort of question of how do we bring that together, and what is the story then that we want to tell with that in bringing it together. But I think that when we talk about this sort of validated need for data, it's not because it doesn't exist, it's because it is sort of in these desperate sort of separate parts. And it's this sort of need to say, if we want to talk globally or we want to talk provincially about these things, how do we bring all of these things together so that we can connect all of the existing data points from all of the community organizations across the province, and then work with people like Liz, who is going to be able to help to make sense of it in a way that is definitely more nuanced, more depthful than what I can do in my organization.
Lana, I know you've got lots of opinions on the structural barriers and the common language, so please chime in.
Yeah, and Casey's question, hi Casey, of the 5 factors or learnings identified, which you feel is the most crucial. And as everyone was talking, I was reflecting over, and Casey can appreciate this, like, remember Holmes data in a hall? And decades ago, we were trying to even just develop program evaluation skill sets. And then I remember working with the FCSS AA on moving FCSS to actually collecting data. So these are FCSS programs throughout Alberta that fund prevention programs throughout. How could we better collect data? So I remember working at that level. And then the Alberta response model, which was child welfare. So just reflecting on like decades of trying to better understand what data we need to be collecting and why. How does it actually link to interventions? Like even a lot of domestic violence programming, often in the interventions don't make the link to the reduction or change of violence. And so even starting to, for us in the sector, the type of interventions we're doing, what type of outcomes do we want to achieve, and even getting clearer in that connection to better understand human and social development and what we can actually expect from the different interventions. Because I think often we've been forced, because of our capitalist system and other, patriarchy, to create these visions of a violence-free Alberta. And I'm guilty of that too, where we're over-promising and maybe under-delivering a little bit, because what is the connection to get to violence-free is we actually have to reimagine and redesign our systems and structures. That's big. That's big stuff. And I think we all are in this sector to stop violence and advance equity and inclusion and human rights. And so how do we get to that? So for me, there's a few major key barriers. First of all, there's no funding for this, and very little funding. Second, we don't have high capacity or competencies across the sector. So even if I think about the Faculty of Social Work or other programs that are supporting and producing social workers in the field, many of us run away from technology. We actually went to social services to do applied work, right? So I think there's that piece around how do we leverage and work with technology? And then how do we build our capacities around data equity frameworks and approaches when we ourselves have been socialized in these systems? So I think there's partially, that's a barrier. I also think early on, we went to different funders who fund large, like lots of organizations, so key funders. they themselves don't have indicators or clarity about what are they expecting from their envelope of funding. And we can actually, if you think about federal money comes to the health system then funds differences, each kind of scaffolding isn't necessarily collecting or identifying benchmarks or measures, and what gets we know what gets identified gets measured, actually we talk about and actually have impact on. So I think there's that. And then the lack of common language and typology, again, because some of us have 20 different funders, we are responsible for that administration to fund, to give back to the feds, to give back to the province, and everybody wants something different. So I think there's that issue as well. The funding mechanism in itself is deeply problematic, as well as short-term funding. We don't have sustainable long-term funding, so we're often flipping to whatever the whim of the funder is. And you're going to see that come out soon too with the National Action Plan to Prevent Gender-Based Violence. Each province and territory now has to get into a bilateral agreement, meaning they have to sign a contract with 3 priority areas that they're going to fund. So there'll be new funds and resources, being sent through to the province. And again, in that area, like, what are we collecting towards? What are the benchmarks? What are we trying to achieve with 4 years of funding? Because that's what will be coming down. So again, I do think this is such an important area. We don't have a lot of funding and resources. We need to build our capacities. And then I think just what I learned from this project, and to Liz's point, is getting small groups together to actually learn and do something maybe far more effective than getting huge, large collaboratives together. Because I think we can keep the R&D process going, the prototyping, learning, next group, prototyping, learning, and next group. And I think that might be a way forward in this work.
That's awesome, Lana. This concept of agility and innovation, we wouldn't be doing you any justice here, Carrie, given that you're the director of innovation at Sagesse. If you want to just jump in on that concept of agile and R&D cycles, that again is very novel to our sector for sure, but how we I'm not sure if the right word is like bastardized it, but we took some ideas out of the R&D world and we're like, man, that's not going to work for us. But we came up with something, that made sense for the social sector as well, that I think is pretty cool, if you want to chime in on it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I do want to just start by actually acknowledging the funders for this project, because, as Lena said, it's not necessarily easy to get funding for an R&D kind of project. And so to have 2 fairly major funders, like we did, willing to invest in something where we essentially said, we have this idea and we want to try this thing out, I think is so great, and such a great example of being willing to step into the world of R&D. When I think about the Data2Action project and where we started and where we are now, one of the things that I think is in some ways the most impactful is I think we didn't use the R&D language when we started this. And it's interesting because I think that we got more comfortable with the R&D language as we tried things and we went, oh, that didn't work the way that we thought it was going to work. And as I've answered in the chat saying that this is the thing that I think is the most important, I'm sure that no one who is on the call who knows me is going to be surprised by the fact that I say this, but I think that that's such an interesting opportunity to try something and have it not go the way that you think, because then it provides us the opportunity to go, oh, okay, well, let's think about what are the assumptions that I made going into this that actually are not correct? What's the next step forward from that? And so I think that the ability of this project to try things and say, okay, this is not necessarily getting us what we thought we were going to get to, or this is not getting us as far as we thought, or this data, when we put all of this data together that we've asked people to just provide to us, we actually don't know enough information about all of this to be able to tell the story and to be able to, present. We can't present those numbers because we don't have that narrative that can go along with it. And I think that all of those learnings for me is part of that R&D cycle, is part of that ability to be agile, and to go back and say, okay, so we thought we were going to be able to do X, but actually we've learned these 3 things. So now what is the new X that we're going to work towards? And how do we continue to do that as a cycle and recognize that there should be iteration, right? We should be trying things, getting feedback from researchers, getting feedback from that research advisory committee was so powerful for that. Our data collaborators were so important in that and so willing to say, no, the thing that you just showed me is not correct. And I think that learning and that capacity for us to say, oh, okay, awesome. Now what do we do? How do we make it correct? What is the next phase of this? I think allows us to work towards, in the end, the opportunity to have a product that actually reflects what is happening, what is important, what is the real story. And I think that, we, if I think about different shared measurement projects that I've been engaged in, when we start with a premise and the premise is confirmed, or we sort of end in that place of, oh, okay, that went exactly where we thought it was going. The question for me is that valuable? Is that worth the sort of time and investment around this thing? Or are we just reaffirming things that we already know? I think when we get into the R&D cycle, I'm not sure that we're very comfortable in it. I live in a place of, it's my happy place, but I know my staff tells me all the time that I might be odd and alone in that place of, this is my happy place to be in that cycle. But I think that if we can start to develop that comfort around saying, we're going to try this, and we know that we're going to end up in a different place than where we think we're going to end up because of the things that we learn along the way, because data collaborators are going to tell us something that we didn't know to ask when we started, and now we know, and therefore we have to go in a different direction. So for me, that's the biggest learning, and I think the greatest opportunity for us as a sector when I think about this project and what happens out of it, and where do we go now.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So it's I want to speak to that too, because I have failed more than I've succeeded in my life. So yes. So it's, and there's a bunch of things on this project too that I, looking back, were the biggest ahas were where we messed up probably the most. And some of the assumptions that we made. So I just remember, like, just even the impetus that we were going to develop a dashboard. Okay, we developed a dashboard. Great. We're going to get everybody to give us data. Okay. Everybody gave us data.
Their own data. We're not going to manage the data. We're going to say, you just give us a whole dump of your own data, and we're going to manage it. Yeah.
And then we're going to tell stories with the data. But what we forgot in there was that all the data coming in was not structured in a way that could actually add up to common sense narrative, because everybody was collecting it in very, very distinct ways. The big data that was coming in from Google had a bunch of biases that we didn't, sure, we know that big data is biased, but we didn't know how biased some of that stuff was. We also said, well, if we put these data sets together and we bring in some of the big systems data, so police reports, et cetera, we said, well, our Alberta Health Services data on reported rates of self-disclosure, et cetera, that'll tell us a better, bigger story. But what we couldn't do is connect the dots in a common sense narrative. For instance, why is Google searches for sexual assault going up in July and at the same time going down for domestic violence in the same month in Alberta, but it's doing the exact opposite thing in BC? Or why are BC rates higher this month, but they're lower in Alberta? Like, the completely different cycles. So it's while we put the dashboard together, it actually poses more questions for us, right, than answers. And maybe that's the point of it, right? Maybe that was we're asking questions that 3 years ago, we just said it would be really cool to look at new data sets in this. So I don't know if anybody wants to chime in on any of those, Liz, Lana, or Carrie.
So I think that the elevation of assumptions is something that we sometimes struggle with, and I struggle with as somebody whose whole work is sort of based in this world of R&D, that it can be easy to look at something once you've made some assumptions and you've tested something and those assumptions prove to be incorrect. It can be easy to look at that and go, why didn't I think of that before? Why didn't I know that before, right? All of those sort of things around, I've made all of these assumptions and maybe I should have had that information before. And so I think that one of the things that I often think about in terms of this type of R&D is we don't know sometimes what our assumptions are until we're in it, right? I had made an assumption that getting that asking data collaborators to provide data that they were already collecting was going to be easier because it was COVID, because everybody was overwhelmed, because we were living in this new world. And it turned out that actually was not correct. And that's great. And it's good learning for me to say, oh, okay, so actually, if we're going to do something like this in the future, where do we need to start instead? But I think that, giving ourselves space to say we all make assumptions, and sometimes you don't even recognize the assumptions until you're in it or until it has proven to be incorrect, and then taking that knowledge and learning and sort of moving forward.
Awesome. There's a question: when looking at data across provinces, what correlations are we attempting to identify, for what purpose? Well, one of the questions that we were looking at is to understand the correlation between help-seeking behaviors online. So the HelpSeeker app connects people to resources, so that we had that data set. We have some call data and interactions with organizations that are receiving requests for assistance, or from the data collaborators. And then we have big data, so the Google search data that we were kind of looking at correlations. But because the data that was coming from collaborators was so disparate, it would be pretty erroneous to assume any calculations. But I mean, what I can tell you, even looking at things like shelter data in Alberta, and correlations between that and Google, there's the shelter data does this, and I'm talking about the CSS reported government open data, not specifically the women's shelter data now, but that data tells one story, and then the search behavior data tells a completely different story. So I would say right now the correlation would be pretty biased for us to only look at those two factors, and that was a big learning, because anyways, I don't want to steal. This is Liz's area too, so do you want to chime in on that, Liz?
Yeah, sure. No, I think what you said, it speaks to it well. And what we learned is that initially we wanted to go in and look at correlations, or maybe to see, could we see if, seasonality was related to the data that was coming in? Are people engaging in more help seeking at a certain time, or related to a certain event that we could help contextualize it? But what we learned was, like Alina said, due to the differences between the ways organizations were collecting the data, we couldn't really look at correlations to answer that question well. We could answer it, but then we would have about 20 different kind of caveats to say, but also you have to remember this and this and this and this and this. And so we weren't confident in telling a very clear story, which is why we haven't shared information in that way. But through working with the collaborators as well as the research advisory committee, we pivoted a bit to say, well, what if instead of having, a finding, a correlation, a p-value, a thing like that, we use this more as a tool to engage in discussions with one another. Because another thing we did want to do throughout the project was just increase communication between organizations. A lot of them are doing similar things, seeing similar trends, but may not have an infrastructure in place to come together at the table and talk about it. And so something that I'm working on right now is there a way for us to maybe just look side by side for all the organizations by season or by quarter or whatever it might be, and then just giving it to them, not to say, here is what I found as Liz Baker, the researcher, But based on what you can see right here from this visualization, can we have a conversation to help us better understand what may have happened, and then to also understand those differences? So why was there a peak maybe for sexual violence, but not domestic violence? How does that compare to the data we have from collaborators as compared to Google? Because we know that, it's a very different type of indicator. And so it may not be so much about the correlations, the findings, but more of how do we facilitate conversations? And I think through those conversations, we can then work to look at more concrete things. But right now it's seen as a tool to help facilitate that communication.
Thanks, Liz. Before we move to our next slide, does anybody else want to chat here on any of these themes? Seeing a no, which is okay. So wanted to connect about the moving forward as well, and just chat a little bit about where we're going, and I'll speak about at least HelpSeeker's take out of this project too, because it was an R&D project for us as well as we were building our infrastructure. So I know this sounds looks intimidating, maybe, I don't know, but for us the biggest takeaway is if we are wanting to move towards this place where we're talking about those correlations, right, where we're trying to make connections between the outcomes that we're getting and the population impacts, for instance, making connections between search behavior and interactions with services. If we're wanting to get there as a sector, there's this middle part that's missing right now. So we have everybody doing their pockets of data collection. We have, I would say, zero data processing infrastructure. And outside of this little R&D experiment, I think we actually have pretty good data mobilization. So once we actually have data, we're pretty good at knowing how to do policy advocacy and bring those insights to decision makers and program services. But the questions that we have as a sector and the data we're currently collecting, they're not connected currently. Right, there's a big gap between those. So what I'm showing you guys here is how we think about data pipelines at HelpSeeker. So there's projects that we do in domestic violence. There's projects that we do in homelessness. We're doing projects on cults right now, just to give you an idea. Like there's questions about everything in our sector that are novel. So you need to have this infrastructure that's able to process these questions and answer them in a meaningful way. But that middle part, that brain that can connect the data, is something that just currently doesn't exist. And the biggest thing that makes that not work is this concept of a common language that was on the other slide as well. So a common language, in the tech world, it's called an ontology. It allows for this interoperability so that the data that comes from shelter A that's collected in one type of way can be connected to the data that's coming in from shelter B that's in a completely different schema. So the ability to actually ingest data and process it so that you can actually say something about the sector in a common way, in a commonly understood way, is the big piece for me that was confirmed, and something that has been a missing thing, not just for domestic violence and sexual violence, but for the social sector overall. So this is by far the biggest investment we've made through last 3 years on building that data infrastructure, that engine to connect the dots in a new way. We haven't implemented it in this project. We're still in the R&D phase on this. Itself was a $5 million investment to get us there because we had to invent something new. But for me, this is what would break that open to answer some of the limitations that we talked about before around common language, and without having everybody go on one technology solution, because that is not going to happen and not realistic given that everybody has to report to various funders. So how can you maintain your kind of independence, autonomy, and data system, still contribute to the systems change effort, but do it in a much more streamlined and consistent way. So I don't know if anybody wants to dive into any of the knowledge graph conversation or ontology conversations, but that's the tech side for sure around what's missing in terms of data infrastructure for moving this forward. And I think we're getting there for sure. The other piece, and again, it's a bit of an Alina's take on it, and just this is my take, like I said before, but it's really this concept of, how do we move from alignment on common language, on ontology and taxonomy, to actually looking at user journeys across organizations. Sorry, this is like a little moves by itself video of dashboards on domestic violence, but having that unified data collection platform so that we're not just looking at one organization at a time, but we're actually looking at the data together across organizations as well. So this is, again, something that that big engine is going to enable us to do, is to actually bring this stuff in, look at demand modeling over time, look at community impact at an individual and network level. I mean, until we get there, it's going to be really tough to move from these disparate data sets into something that is consistent. So those are kind of my takeaways and closing remarks, and what HelpSeeker has been doing with this information, because our job is to also bring this knowledge to the 3,000 organizations that are using our platform, and how do we bring this domestic violence and sexual violence lens to decision makers in the homeless sector as well, and how do we connect the dots between what's happening around domestic violence searches and what might be happening around food security. We need to think across systems at the same time, so the infrastructure can't only work for one issue area or one population. It has to actually bring us all together, because we're all in the social safety net. We're all key components of it. So only focusing on 2% of the sector without that broader view is going to be really, we're not going to move the needle in a meaningful way. So that to me is a big push for sure. With that, any closing remarks with a slide on systems change and the need for systems thinking and holistic thinking? Any closing remarks from our speakers as well?
Alina, thanks for that, and thanks to HelpSeeker and what you're trying to do at such a large and impactful level. And I do think thinking about systems change and starting to build our capacities for both R&D and systems change, I think, is the go forward for our sector, and super important. And then I'd also just want to add, like, around data literacy, of prioritizing that. And Liz has started to work, and we had approached the data scientists at the fact. So it's even just starting with your spheres of influence, right? Like, so thinking about the university, who's producing and promoting data scientists, what kind of competencies do they have around data equity, ethics, all these areas, because Liz and I learned in a meeting, there isn't even an ethics course, right? So just thinking about who's producing and working on that end, I think, is important, and informing and influencing that. And then I do think going forward for Shift, we'll continue to prototype with partners who are ready and willing and wanting to move forward on particular areas, and keep an R&D model going as we move forward to support the DV sector as well. So yeah, thank you so much. And thanks to everybody for attending today. And again, thank you to the collaborators and the research committee. They were amazing as an oversight group, and really gave a lot of time and energy to help shape this project. So I just wanted to do a big shout out to them as well. And to Liz, sorry, I just wanted to move over to Liz. Sorry, Carrie, but Liz really was the lead on the ground. And I just want to honor and thank Liz for her violence prevention background plus data science background. And she was able to merge that to really inform and influence this initiative. And I just wanted to thank Liz, because the on the ground, the really granular learnings have really come from her and her experience with the collaborators. And I just want to thank her for pushing this project and making it happen.
And I just want to say, in terms of sort of next steps, and again, another thank you to the data collaborators. From an impact perspective, we are continuing to engage with our data collaborators to learn what are their learnings from this project and what are the things that they would like to see moving forward within how we think about and engage in R&D projects related to data and to the sectors that we work in and the people that we are serving. And so we're looking forward to continuing to work with them and to be really grounded in that sort of community need around this issue and figuring out how to continue moving the needle forward. So thank you. And thanks to everyone for attending.
Thank you guys so much. Before I thank the speakers and let you go, the next webinar, let me give you like two word explanation of what the theme is going to be. So it's from guns and gangs to cats and cults, the importance of deeply understanding the ever-growing complex needs of your community. Believe you me, the things we're seeing popping up across this country in terms of social challenges are like, I don't know, maybe it's because we're looking in a different way. Maybe it's because these new data sets are coming in that are unearthing some of these things. But we're literally doing work in these topics right now. And of course, there's everything, your typical poverty reduction, homelessness, mental health, addictions, but we're seeing some really interesting, novel challenges pop up that I think would be interesting to share with our community. So yeah, if you're struggling with how do you understand the social needs at the community level, how do you pick up on these new challenges, this might be a good one for you. We're doing tons and tons of work around gun and gang interventions in different communities. It's coming up as a major problem. And again, we see this out of the US as well, where certain types of crime have really blown up post-COVID. So we're going to share more about that. And then things even like cults. So new cults emergent that are targeting vulnerable communities. And what does that mean for that community? Cats, believe me, like the conversations we've been having about stray pets as well. So there's very interesting and concerning trends that we should all be aware of. So if you are interested, it's February 16, 10 a.m. Mountain Time. We'll love to see you there. And there's a little QR code as well there for you. So you can pre-register while you're here. With that being said, I just want to thank Lana, Liz, Carrie. You've been the best of partners because you don't go the easy way on anything. And you don't accept mediocrity, including that of a sector that's wanting to do so much better. And how do we actually challenge it and have these fierce conversations without kind of shying away from them as well. And I think this project was a really great example of us putting our best thinking forward, our critical thinking forward, and our brave intent to do better and know better. So I just wanted to thank you guys for being amazing partners on this. And I learned more than I gave, and that's time well spent and resources well spent for me and my team for sure. Thank you guys. We'll circle back with the presentation and the recording, of course, and we will for sure be connecting with the data collaborators because we as Carrie mentioned, there's still more conversations that we're able to have with you guys one-on-one that we can't have with the broader community because your data is private, of course. But until then and until next time, thank you guys. Have a good one.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.